increased rainfall. But that diversity will help us work together well. And I can think of no better host for COP27 than Egypt, with its founding member of the non-aligned movement and as a sort of a renewable superpower in the making. Later this week, our COP President Alex Sharma will be in Cairo and we'll be discussing more closely with our Egyptian friends how we can take this challenge forward to ensure that the negotiations at COP27 are a success, to support investment in low carbon projects, and to support Egypt as it takes steps to further green its economy. Thank you.
شكرا للسيد جون مارتن المبعوث الخاص للمناخ لحكومة المملكة المتحدة. أعود مرة أخرى منصة وتحديدا للسفير محمد نصر.
Where we'll be talking with Ambassador Mohammed Nasser, the head of Sustainable Development, Climate Change, and the head of the negotiators in Africa. And it's very important, the question is to know the answer of the question. African and developing countries, how will they be able to face challenges to implement programs in order to face climate change? Thank you, Your Excellency, President Fattah el-Sisi, Your Excellencies, August Gathering. Before I answer the question, I would like to refer to three important points. In fact, they are political negotiations in terms of climate change. The second aspect, climate change is not an environmental matter, but it is a developmental, as the development, in fact, types and development will be different, as we heard from John Biden and else, starting agriculture, trade, all economic sectors will be affected due to climate change. The delegation of Egypt is a delegation between Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Trade. Regarding funding is led by Egypt for the African Group for Developing Countries. At the level of experts is led by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. At the ministerial level is led by the Minister of Environment, as we listen to Mr. John Kerry, appreciating the role and the efforts of Egypt in negotiation. This is the first part. You asked me how developing countries will deal with the challenges imposed by climate change. We have a major part, which is funding. As His Excellency Prime Minister referred to it, we have impacts and we have needs for developing countries through our membership in the negotiation and membership in funding committees. We can say that we have three major points represent challenge to developing countries in terms of dealing with climate change from the funding aspect. The gap between the needs of developing countries and what's available in financing. In the last definition was the needs of developing countries, $3.5 trillion till 2030, while the flow of funding going to developing countries does not exceed $600 million. So we have a funding gap, which is a huge, and I think that we have to deal with it strongly, and the status of developing countries are clear. The unproportionality of financial instruments with the needs and the circumstances of developing countries. Most available funding is a funding in the form of loans, commercial loans specifically, and concessional finance is very limited. Many countries, particularly in the African continent, are facing a problem to take loans because simply they are countries with high debts, hence decision makers face the problem to take more loans, and of course this will be on the burden of the coming generations. So how they will deal with the dilemma of providing funding and also with climate change impacts and economic transformation, and the funding from donor in fact countries is still in the form of loans and not concessional loans. The final point, accessibility to funding. In order to take the loan, the conditions that and the requirements from the funding institutions in fact makes it difficult for the countries in Africa in fact to have accessibility accessibility for available funding or accessibility to financing institutions. This is a challenge facing developing countries. In the negotiations, we are trying, through the decisions coming out from the state parties, we come out with the guidance from the international community and financing agencies. We are putting this on top of the agenda. And in Glasgow, we listened to Mr. John Kerry, and he talked about trillions and 100 million. Of course, the difference between 100 million and trillions, but the process and the policies in order to transfer from trillions to millions is still in the hands of financing agencies. They are still committed to the measures that are taken previously, and people seeking loans, they should have a bankable projects that could be implemented on grounds and to achieve financial returns. And we have to bear in mind the dimension of climate change and also the environmental dimension. And I don't want to be lengthy. The pressure of developing countries and the African countries is to deal with these 3 points. First point, to direct and to have a concessional finance and to focus on, in fact, on grants and not on loans. The third part, try to deal with the international financing agencies to change the mindset, as they don't bear in mind the importance to accelerate our transformation in order to implement all our needs and projects. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Mohammed Nasr, the head of the administration of climate environment in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's very important to know, while talking about the way to Sharm El Sheikh Summit COP27, it's very important to go back to Glasgow Summit. And going back to the forum, Mrs. Cathy Flynn, the Strategic Council for Climate Change, the Executive Bureau of the United Nations Environment Program. What are the objectives that we assume to come out from Glasgow Summit?
Shukran. It is an honor to be here. Thank you so much, President al-Sisi, the government of Egypt, Honorable Prime Minister. Thank you for initiating these discussions. It is these moments where we all come together to be able to reflect on these international negotiations that help to pave the way for openings and for moments, dare I say, of hope in being able to address the climate crisis. You asked about Glasgow, and certainly Glasgow gave us some steps forward. They were not the leaps that we needed or that we had hoped for, but there are moments that are helping to pave the way toward enhanced climate action. And the first is really on these national pledges. Countries came to Glasgow with national pledges and able to say that they were going to make bold moves on energy, bold moves on adaptation, bold moves on protecting nature, and being able to start on the road down toward sustainable development. And when we look at this, and while we say, oh, pledges on paper may not mean much, these pledges do mean a great deal, because the first round of pledges that were submitted in 2015, when we added them together, they put us at a range of about 2.5 degrees temperature rise, which puts us in a very, very dangerous territory. But now, 6 years later, with these revised, with these enhanced pledges, they put us on a track that is much more closer to 1.5. And while we have a long way to go, while we have much urgent action that needs to be taken, we are on this pathway. And this is where COP27 is so critically important. While Glasgow gave us plans, they gave us words, they gave us ways that we can have a direction moving forward, now with COP27, we can start to see that transformation. We can start to talk about what it takes to turn these pledges into action. What types of bold moves on energy? been hearing so much, and thank you so much, Honorable Prime Minister, for sharing some of these plans in Egypt that are, I think, models for the rest of the world as you are thinking about these big choices that have to be made. Also, in thinking about increasing resilience to climate impacts, access to technology, access to the finance that the ambassador was talking about. These are the levers that will help turn some of these pledges into real action on the ground. And this is the challenge ahead of us at Sharm El Sheikh, to be able to turn this into a momentum, turn this into transformation where we can really see some of these impacts on the ground. And I think, finally, when it comes to the road from Glasgow to Sharm El Sheikh, we have to talk about hope. Because as people are looking around the world, and we've heard so much from youth about how scared they are. They see these wildfires, they see extreme heat, they see drought, and it can be very, very overwhelming. And for Sharm El Sheikh, and I'm looking at the walls here, development, humanity, peace, creativity, this is the perfect place to have these discussions, because that is what we need when it comes to the climate crisis. It is bringing all of these pieces together to be able to think out of the box, to be able to push the envelope, to be able to cause this transformation that the world so desperately needs, and to be able to tell that story, and for Egypt to be able to lead the way in telling that story about what transformation really looks like on the ground. So thank you very much, and looking forward to further conversations.
شكرا سيدة
Thank you
كاسي
so
فلاين
much,
المستشار
Ms.
الاستراتيجي
Cassie
بشأن التغير
Fline,
المناخ بالمكتب التنفيذي لبرنامج الأمم المتحدة
for
الإنمائي.
climate change in
ويعني الكلمة عن
UNDP,
الأمل وضرورة وجود الأمل لحل
she
هذه
spoke about
المشكلة.
hope, how important hope
يعني
is to solve this
ولكن مهم
problem.
أيضا أن
However,
نسلط
it's
الضوء
really
على
important
المشكلة
to shed
حتى
light
نتعامل
on the
معها
problem in order
خارج
to be
الصندوق زي
able
ما
to
حضرتك
tackle it
ذكرتي.
outside
خلينا
of the
نتجه
box, like
للسيدة
you said.
إنجر
Let's now
أندرسون
head
المدير
to
التنفيذي
Ms.
لبرنامج
Inger
الأمم
Anderson, the
المتحدة
Executive
للبيئة،
Director
وهي موجودة
of
معنا
the
عن
UN
بعد.
Environment Program.
سيدة
She's
أندرسون بنرحب
here
بحضرتك
with us remotely, actually. And Ms. Anderson, what are the most important challenges that the Middle East and Africa will be facing, especially when it comes to local communities?
Thank you. And let me start by expressing appreciation to Egypt for hosting this conference. It's obviously very, very critical, and my deep appreciation to President al-Sisi for his strong leadership in this regard, and of course to Prime Minister Madbouli and Foreign Minister Shukri. We expect to see Egypt step into the very same role that they had when they held the presidency for the biodiversity COP, which Egypt hosted in Sharm El Sheikh in 2014 with great success. So let me just say that yes, we got a long way in Glasgow, and we appreciated that. And we very much appreciated that. But of course, we have a long way to go. We saw that, and we just heard that from the colleague from UNDP, we saw that there has been an increase in commitments by countries, and we salute that. But the increase is not enough. And when we understand that the G20, these 20 economies, are responsible for 76% of all emissions, we have to understand that the strong commitments need to happen where it needs to happen in those larger emitting countries. And so that is where the emphasis needs to be right now when it comes to mitigation. When we speak about adaptation, we have to be sure that the promises we make way back in COP15 in Copenhagen, where we said that by 2020, we will have 100 billion on the table every year. That promise has not yet been met, and yet our calendar says 2022. So there is another to-do item there for the countries that have the responsibility to put money on the table. And indeed, we heard that just now from Mohammed Nasr. So I think that there are some critical issues that we need to not glaze over and have a very honest conversation about. Now, don't get me wrong, Glasgow was a great success. We got some very, very important elements. We got the first mention ever of coal. We got the first mention ever of subsidies. Not quite as strong as we might have liked, but there it was. We got a commitment on methane, and we're very proud of that. We saw a louder voice across the world on key issues, and that was critical too. But we have to do items, because when we add it all up, and that is of course what UNEP does in our emissions gap report, when we looked at all the NDCs pre-COP Glasgow, we were heading towards a world in 2100 at 2.7 degrees. Then we said, okay, let's take all the commitments that have been made during Glasgow, and we take the goodwill of the net zero commitments, even though they're not quite as clear as they should be, and they mix some of the gases up, etc., and are not quite clear. We take all of that, and where do we land? We land at 2.3 degrees. So friends, we have ways to journey, and the to-do item lies with the biggest emitters. Now, we are very happy that we saw some leaning in, but there's more to be done, because if not, we will see more storms, more floods, more wildfires, more water shortages, and more displacement, and that cannot happen. So the good news is we still have time to change. We can still, with determination, with activism, with energy, with ideas, and with youth at the forefront, build a greener and more prosperous world. And I mentioned youth at the forefront, not to let other generations abscond from their responsibility. I mentioned youth to encourage youth to be that brave and powerful voice, to be that tireless energy, and to reverberate in social, in economic, in political, and in environmental spheres. And the work starts right now. We need to shift into emergency gear, which is why it is so critical that Egypt, under its heads of state, President Sisi, has convened this meeting with young voices there, with leadership across the world, with ambassadors present, with that commitment. We have this year, before we head to Sharm El Sheikh, some opportunities to push. And here, of course, I want to mention a United Nations Environment Program, because Egypt has been a strong builder of UNEP and obviously a strong architect of UNEP during our journey. We turn 50 this year, and we will be hosting in March here in beautiful Nairobi, from where I speak to you, UNEP at 50. And later on, we will be hosting Stockholm Plus 50, and of course, World Environment Day. And there are abilities there to really push on the issue of climate and on youth activism. Now, many of the young people in the audience may say, but how do I get involved? And that is a word that we often hear. But look, you really have an opportunity to change, to consider how you can be the change makers. You can become the brave voices inside corporate organizations. You can use your vote to put in place leaders that are leaning in on this issue. You can obviously push for your schools, your faith groups, your organizations to really move in this direction. You can organize and start green businesses, and you can absolutely ensure that you make your own footprint less and organize your families across the world to do likewise. We clearly have a lot of work to do. We all have to play our part. Egypt has shown amazing leadership by, as I said, holding the presidency for the Biological Convention, the 14th COP in Sharm El Sheikh, and a long presidency because of COVID and the delay. And now Egypt will lead the next conference of parties on climate change to take place in beautiful Sharm El Sheikh again later this year. We need more such leadership, together working across generations, fired up by the energy of youth. We can change the world, and youth are not willing to settle into the same groove that has worn deep wounds into our planet. You're not willing to just be part of the future. You can and must define the future because it is yours. So allow me to close in the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who's passing we all mourn this month. Do your little bit of good where you are. It's those little bits of good put together that overwhelm the world. Thank you.
شكرا سيدة إنجر أندرسون المدير التنفيذي لبرنامج الأمم المتحدة للبيئة. أما عن دور الإعلام والفنون فالمؤكد أنه قبل 10 أعوام يعني لم يكن هناك اهتمام بتسليط الضوء على المناخ والتغيرات المناخية ومخاطر هذه التغيرات المناخية، ولكن أصبح الإعلام عالميا يهتم بهذا الموضوع. معنا سيد بالواير وهو مراسل شؤون المناخ في
issue. And now we have Mr. Bill Wayne, CNN announcer, chief climate correspondent. In fact, the biggest natural, what were the biggest natural phenomena that you monitored? You can tell us about this, please.
Shukran, thank you so much for having me. Hello to all of you in Egypt. Very fond of your country and so honored to be part of this here today. I've been everywhere this summer. I was stood on the Iceland, on the Greenland ice sheet and watched the melting there that is going to change coastal communities from Sharm El Sheikh to Boston to Shanghai. I stood and watched the wildfires that raged across the American West. I was there for hurricanes that started in the Gulf Coast of the United States and ended up thousands of miles away, drowning people in their basement apartments in New York City. We had tornadoes, which are supposed to happen in the middle of the summer, in the middle of winter in the American heartland. And so it is everywhere. 2021, at least in my country, was by far the deadliest and most expensive. It beat the record set in 2020 by $50 billion, by hundreds of lives. And so it is in our faces every day. But unfortunately, the way human nature works is we're all made of stories. You know, everything in our lives, our borders, our flags, our currencies, are stories that we've agreed upon. And those stories are always changing. But this story doesn't seem to be changing fast enough because we don't have a massive event, a 9/11, for example, of climate change, because it happens sporadically around the world. Human psychology is able to dismiss it. And unfortunately, there are far too many people in my country and others who see it as a distant threat, that it's a story about polar bears or farmers or fishermen across the world that they will never, ever meet. And so I think what we're realizing as journalists and storytellers is that the story has to change. We have to connect the dots between everybody's personal well-being, what's happening to their family, their finances, to these global phenomena, because everything is connected. And with all due respect to my fellow panelists, and I don't envy them having to go to COPs and try to negotiate over language and get something that almost 200 countries can agree on, but it took 26 conference of parties for them to even say the word coal, to even talk about the sources of the problems. And unfortunately, we're running out of time. And we have to come to grips with the idea that in order to meet the goals that are being laid out, all of the pledges of COPs and then these, we're going to need an entirely new way of life, new energy systems, new airplanes, new kinds of cement for buildings, new housing, new transportation. And that's a lot for us to absorb. You know, all the things we think made humanity superior now, it turns out, are hurting us and are threatening your generation, the generation of my baby boy. And that is a lot. And you have to sort of go through the 5 stages of grief to realize that one way or another, the planet Earth that I grew up on is gone now. And the Cinderella climate that gave us, you know, the richest economies in the world and can support 7 billion people around the world is gone. And we have to not only try to mitigate the causes of this in the ways that all the delegates are talking about, that is getting off of fuels that burn as fast as possible. But we also have to brace for what's already built into the system, an adaptation. And I see it in cities like Charleston, South Carolina, where they're building $1 billion seawall to protect themselves from rising sea levels. And people are just now starting to connect the dots between what's happening in the Greenland ice sheet with what's happening in the deep south of the United States. And so I think eventually all journalists are going to be climate journalists, whether they like it or not, sort of the way that all reporters became public health experts and vaccine immunologist experts had to during the COVID pandemic. And I think we can learn a lot of lessons from that sort of global emergency in what happens when life as we know it, when our predictable world shuts down and you're not guaranteed a flight to see your grandmother, or you're not guaranteed flights to see a theater show anymore. It gives us hope in that when scientists from around the world work together, we can come up with amazing vaccines in an amazingly short amount of time. But then you see the political and the human responses to that. Those who don't believe in the science, who don't want to get the vaccine, who, for various reasons, just because of the stories that they've been told and believe in, don't see the miracle of that scientific achievement. And I hope we can learn from that lesson, and we can realize that that a less habitable world becomes a less hospitable world. And now is the time to connect communities. We saw during the COVID pandemic that the communities that waited for their citizens to start dying before they acted suffered the most, but those who rallied together with belief in the scientists got out relatively unscathed. But we're still working our way through this. And unfortunately, given the time scale and our ability to adapt to new discomfort, is why we're sort of in the position we're in. But we are all made of stories, and systems are made of human stories. And the sooner we change that, the sooner we talk to each other and can connect with each other over our shared values, and to connect with even those who may not believe the science, but they know that something has changed. There's not as many fish in this water as there were when I was a boy, or the smoke in the air is thicker. Making those connections is vital for us to move past a point of arguing over the cause of the fire or whether or not there is a fire, but how we can collectively put it out.
شكرا سيد بيل المذيع والكاتب والمنتج ومراسل شؤون المناخ لشبكة CNN. اتجه للسيدة يولند رايت المدير العالمي لفريق فقر الأطفال والمناخ والحضر بمنظمة إنقاذ الطفولة الدولية. ولا شك أنه إذا كانت التغيرات المناخية تؤثر علينا جميعا، ولكنها تؤثر بشكل خاص على الشباب وتؤثر أيضا على قضية الهجرة المناخية، كيف تنعكس بظلالها على هذه القضية.
How does climate change cast its shadows on this?
Thank you so much, everyone. Excellencies, Honourable Prime Minister, distinguished guests, and fantastic youth representatives from around the world gathering in Sharm El Sheikh today. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to you all. As others have already mentioned, the climate crisis is most definitely a crisis for the youth and for children, because it's young people, it's children, it's the babies that people have been talking about that are going to be living through a very different climate, a very different life than that the older generation, such as myself, have lived through. And that's what I wanted to try and talk about today, and how important it is that we make the progress that we need to see from Glasgow to Sharm El Sheikh and beyond, and use this really critical decade, the 8 years that John Kerry talked about, to really make the transformations we need to see. So one of the things I wanted to mention is exactly as you said, that children are going to be seeing a very different world. We brought out some research last year with Bray University in Brussels, looking at climate predictions and the impacts on a baby born in 2020, and how different it was from the impacts on their grandfather or grandmother born in, say, 1960. And it was really a shocking report. globally, on average, a baby born in 2020 will face 2 times more wildfires, 3 times more river floods, 7 times more heat waves. But we also looked at the regional differentiation. And again, I found that quite shocking. And I think for those of you gathered in Egypt today, it will be particularly pertinent to recognize that for countries in the Middle East, for countries in North Africa, the number of heat waves are even more extreme. There'll be up to 9 times more heat waves. More extreme events like floods, again, 3 times more floods for that region of the world. And so these impacts affect everybody, as we were hearing, and there is a thread that links every single person in the whole of the world with this issue, but there are some inequalities in those impacts, and some people in some places, some families, some children will be particularly worst affected. And unfortunately, it is those countries and those families with the lowest income who perhaps can least afford to cope with the shocks that are coming, that will face those biggest shocks. So I think there's no doubt now about the science. I think one of the big things about last year, not only was the COP conference, but was also the big report that came out that said the scientists all over the world are unequivocal now in saying climate change is happening. It's not happening in the future. It's happening now. And it's no longer in doubt that it's absolutely through human-induced climate change, that we are causing this to happen, and that we can now also recognize that we can do something about it. And it's those actions, it's that what can we do about it, that we really need to be accelerating. And otherwise, we know that children will be the first and worst to suffer. And just right now, as I speak, it's horrific to think that we're predicting that this year an increasing number of people will be needing humanitarian aid. So the estimate from the UN that came out in December is that 274 million people this year, around half of them will be children, will be needing humanitarian assistance. Some of that's as a result of COVID, some of that's as a result of conflict, but a huge amount of it is as a result of the climate crisis, of droughts that are affecting areas such as the Horn of Africa and southern Madagascar, of unprecedented extreme events that are hitting places in Asia, such as the Philippines, which suffered from another really strong cyclone, which are getting ever stronger as global sea temperatures are rising. So when we're tackling the road from Sharm El Sheikh to COP27, we need to think about tackling these inequalities. We need to think about how we bring it into our thoughts, those suffering on the front line of the climate crisis. So we need to reflect on some of the commitments that were made in Glasgow, and how do we really ensure that those commitments are met. There was an unprecedented number of commitments that many people have mentioned, including on financing, but we really need to make sure that that financing is delivered at the levels that are needed. And of course, we need financing for mitigation, for tackling the root causes, for all these renewable energy projects, et cetera, that we've seen that Egypt are really taking a huge leadership role on. Of course, we need to tackle the root cause and find new green solutions to meeting our energy needs, to meeting our transport needs, to meeting our food needs. But we also need
أنا بعتذر عن المقاطعة ولكن
I'm sorry to be interrupting you, but unfortunately we're running out of time, so I would like to thank you for your intervention. Miss Yolan Dryk, Global Director, Child Poverty, Climate and Urban Health, Save the Children. Thank you so much. And now I give the floor to Mr. Fabrizio Carboni, Regional Director of Near and Middle East ICRC. Mr. Fabrizio, he is with us remotely. And sir, if you could please speak to us briefly about the role played by the Red Cross, especially when it comes to conflict areas regarding countering climate change.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you, and to be honest, I'm a bit humbled to speak about the climate crisis in front of the Youth Forum, because we cannot ignore that my generation is accountable to the world we're going to live, to this new generation. And for the time being, we can't say that we're doing a great work. So we've heard during this conference that climate and environmental crisis is affecting everyone. But we are not all affected to the same degrees, and our capacity to fight and to adapt to climate change are not equal. In the ICSC, we work in conflict-affected countries, and we see that they are less able to adapt to climate change because of the disruptive effect of wars. It includes weakened governance and institutions that drastically limit the countries' and communities' capacity to adapt to changing climate. Therefore, there is a need for greater support to help people cope with and adapt to climate change in most fragile states. Holding the upcoming COP in Egypt, we believe is a great opportunity because the country lies in two of the regions most vulnerable to climate change, Africa and Middle East. And it's an opportunity to stress on the need of major and urgent political efforts to reduce the impact of climate risk on people and the environment. As ICSC, what we try to do is to reinforce the capacity of affected community to become more resilient to shocks resulting from changing climate and degraded environments, and also to reduce people exposure through anticipatory action. There is also a specificity to our organization because we believe that the respect of the law of armed conflict, the humanitarian law, which protects the natural environment, limits also the risks that community are exposed to and contribute to make them way more resilient. The climate crisis matters to us because we are seeing in the field how it's deepening the vulnerability of the people we work with. And yet, climate action fails to reach them, in part because of the challenges attached to working in such surroundings. But this needs absolutely to change. So how do we try to address this is that we're tackling the issue both at the strategic political level and at the operational level to make sure that the conflict-affected population adapt to changing climate. Across the Middle East and Africa region, the ICSC focus on sustainable access to water, and it's at the same time the supply of water and obviously the way we use water. We work on hydraulic system development. We develop them mainly in poorest area around the world. And the idea is to contribute in solving massive water shortages by increasing the resilience of the water systems and avoid system shutdown due to factors like lack of electricity or maintenance. The systems are interconnected. When one fails, the other can too. For example, a water treatment plant depends on electricity. When there is not enough power supply, dirty water isn't treated and it's pumped into the sea. So in the ICSC, we have resilience program aims to understand these systems and how they interconnected and find ways to increase their resilience to shock. We are also supporting agriculture with ecological insect traps and establishing seed banks, and by supporting the rehabilitation of irrigation schemes, the production of animal feed or seeds. No. We also have to work on protecting community from flood and erosion. For instance, we are rehabilitating terraces and riverbanks with metallic gabions, repairing damaged pumping station, and in protecting the sewage system from sea erosion. So now going towards the COP27, when collectively we need to do more to live up to our commitment to support the most vulnerable in face of the growing climate crisis, so they can adapt in a safer manner to avoid unavoidable changes. We urge the party to the UNFCCC to acknowledge and draw attention to the particular vulnerability to climate risks of countries and communities enduring conflict, as it is essential to ensure adequate climate action in these settings. We are calling for greater support to help people cope with and adapt to climate change in fragile states. Despite the clear vulnerability.
شكرا. طيب إذا كنا يعني تحدثنا في كل
If we have addressed, if we talked about the efforts conducted by the government, civil society, private sector, and we talked about the media, it's very important to talk about the role of startups and the private sector in this important topic. And those who are trying to solve this problem will be the youth. So it's very important to be engaged. If you will excuse me to speak quickly. Now, Mr. Aqil Hajjat, the founder of C12 in Africa for consultations. Through your experience, you provide environmental and developmental consultations in Africa. How this issue and the issue of climate change affect development efforts, in particularly in Africa. What's the role of startups in this issue?
Thank you. I'll try and be brief as well. I think the private sector has an absolutely critical role to play in this issue, particularly in an African context. I'll give you the example of my country, Malawi, which is where we face a suite of multiple challenges from a development perspective. We have a rapidly growing population, we have economic challenges, we have governance challenges, and then we are supposed to deal with the development challenges issued by with climate change. Leveraging the private sector has proven to be one of the most effective ways of doing just that. I'll give you two examples, with one which is the Mpatamanga hydro project, which effectively doubles the country's energy supply, electricity supply, and that's leveraged through a public-private sector partnership. Another is the Shiri Basin River Basin Transformation Project, which provides irrigation infrastructure to 2 southern districts and multitudes of farmers, again, through the private sector. These are both PPPs. Even here in Egypt, this model has been successful, having seen billions of dollars across 58 projects since 1990. So it's a very familiar concept for the African nations, but it needs to be captured in a way which aligns with sustainable development goals under the Paris Agreement. John Kerry said we have 8 years to tackle this issue and that we're not moving fast enough. Well, the private sector is fast enough. Private sector is nimble, it is adaptable, and it's capable at moving at the speeds that we require. It also contains the technical capacity to bridge knowledge gaps and can provide a similar technical assistance resource to what we see with the Santiago network. The key is understanding how to leverage this and strategically look at the sector, prioritizing climate-smart development. If you want to break it down to basics, you will see that companies act for 2 reasons. The first is because they have to, that is to do with regulation. And the second is because they want to, and that is to do with market opportunities, it's to do with business cases, and it's to do with incentives. Balancing these 2 aspects is the way to channel the private sector towards helping to align with the broad goals in dealing with this issue. And for me, finally, this links to a key issue for young people. Young people need decent work and opportunities. The youth of Malawi, for example, where I'm from, are not interested in scratching a subsistence living like their forefathers. They want good jobs, and we need to be able to understand that and set up a business environment which caters for that in a sustainable and climate-smart way. Thank you.
شكرا وشكرا للإيجاز أيضا السيد عقيل حجاج.
Mr. Aqil, for being so brief. And thank you for your valuable words. Now I give the floor to Mr. Karim Tarraf. You are the founder of Hawa Dawa, and you have endeavors in measuring air pollution. You also provide relevant data to governments in this regard. So the question here is, how can companies help governments and communities in attaining clean air? Thank you. First, I would like to thank His Excellency the President and the organizers of the conference for this opportunity. I would like to speak to you about Hawadawa's experience. We focus on air pollution and climate change because air pollutants have very negative impacts, and we cannot achieve our climate goals without focusing on these pollutants that affect climate and health. So when the governments want to measure such pollutants, they buy huge containers that need constant maintenance. And since such data touch all aspects of life, the coverage of these stations are not enough. There are more than 100 countries that don't have the capacities to measure air pollution, and even countries that invest heavily in this area have one station for every 2 million citizens. So in Hawadawa, what we did was that we employed artificial intelligence in order to use it in smaller devices that could be used in many areas where we can collect data, not only about pollutants, but also about traffic, wind, population, so that we would be able to track the hotspots in order to have certain short-term policies and strategies to tackle the underlying issues. So this is really the role of emerging companies or enterprises. Here we're speaking about the very short term. We're speaking about 8 years, and also we have the challenge of rapidly changing technologies. So we need to be able to cater to the relevant needs under these two challenges. And hence, I think that entrepreneurial projects are very important therein. Thank you so much, Mr. Karim. Thank you so much. I would like to apologize to Mr. Marco Schultz, but now I would like to give the floor to His Excellency President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi to comment. I just want to tell you that we should give the opportunity to our guests to speak. His Excellency the President says that we should give the opportunity, then the opportunity shall be given. Thank you so much, Your Excellency. What I wanted to mention is that youth-based companies have the opportunity and the capacity to have scalable work models or business models. And this is the startups system of work. And this is exactly what we need in COP27, because if we don't do this, then we will be speaking about risks and technologies without any bridge between them. There will always be a gap. And so there won't be any improvement of policies, their efficiency. And if we work without data, then this cannot be done, really. Thank you so much. I really apologize for interrupting you, but since you spoke about technology, then I think that this is one of the fields that Mr. Marco Schultz is really interested in. Mr. Marco Schultz, could you please speak to us a little bit about the role played by technology in this issue?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. President, for giving me the floor. Thank you, Excellencies. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience, for engaging in this really important discussion. And let me start off with a brief anecdote, and I promise I will keep it short. I recently watched the movie Don't Look Up, and the storyline goes like that. 2 researchers are finding a comet that is bound to hit and destroy Earth. And we have 6 months and 14 days remaining. The outcome is humanity fails and we all die. Only a handful of individuals are escaping Earth on a spaceship. And yes, this storyline is meant to represent our current climate situation. However, the makers of this movie get one detail very wrong. In our situation, these 2 researchers would have never been able to detect the comet in time. Our climate accounting systems are simply not sufficient to detect what is going on right now in our world. For example, China submitted their last climate data in 2019 using data that is from 2012, so 10-year-old data. The European Union and my home country, Germany, submitted their last data in 2019 using 2016 and 2016-17 data. Egypt submitted their data in 2019 using 2015 data. The US submitted their data in 2021, but also only using 2019 data. So at the time when this data is getting submitted, it is already outdated. And I'm not pointing any fingers on countries. These are just examples, but I could put my fingers at every single country in the world right now. It is a systemic issue that our accounting systems are simply not sufficient to deal with the global coordination challenge that we're currently facing. So that is my answer to why do we need technology and why do we need to innovate our climate system. We have the potential now with emerging digital technologies like the Internet of Things, Karim was mentioning it, with remote sensing capabilities where we look at the holistic Earth system rather than at just single actors and trying to make them report whatever they are doing. We have machine learning that is already ruling our social networks that we can also use for a good purpose by using it to verify data and predict what do we need to change to support policy making. And we have distributed ledger technology or blockchain that makes data accessible to everyone in a trustless manner. But this innovation cannot happen in isolation, but we need a group of very different actors to collaborate on this. And there are three key actors in this group. The one is represented here with non-state actors and companies that can move very fast and have the capacity to innovate themselves and drive change. We have subnational actors like cities and regions that are driving ambition at the subnational level. We have countries from the global south that have already vast experiencing in leapfrogging into digital technologies and innovate themselves because they don't have the capacities to do the accounting that is needed right now. And then, most importantly probably, and that's the reason why I'm here, is the youth. The youth is a digitally emerging generation that is already digitally native, and their voice is getting louder and clearer every day. So what we need to, in order to dodge this climate comet, to come back to the initial story, is to think about how can we integrate the lessons from the youth and how can we support them and learn from them and develop future systems together to hold our actors accountable, but also to enable them to make policy making that is looking forward and to really design the future systems rather than just focusing on criticizing the status quo. شكرا.
شكرا ماركو شليتز الباحث والاستشاري في Open Earth Foundation. واكيد انه في هذا الملتقى منتدى شباب العالم هيكون في فرص اكثر للاستماع ولتبادل الخبرات في هذا الموضوع. الان الكلمه للسيد الرئيس عبد الفتاح السيسي.
شكرا جزيلا
Thank you so much. Allow me at the outset to welcome you, to thank you for this fruitful discussion of this very important topic. And I would like to thank you a lot for being a catalyzing force for COP27 that will be held in Sharm El Sheikh this year. I will be speaking maybe from a different perspective. In fact, the human beings are the only creatures on the face of the earth who are capable of destroying, but they are also capable of reforming and restoring. So they are capable of both human beings. And so I won't be saying that I don't sense the danger that you're speaking about, that we're all speaking about, but I'll be speaking to you about the Egyptian experience briefly throughout the past years. But I just wanted to start out with telling you this in order for you to hear it and I'm addressing the youth, our youth in Egypt and the youth of the world. God has created human beings capable of development, capable of building. So any negative developments that you see, be certain that we have the capacities to counter them. I'm not speaking about certain aspects or certain fields. I'm speaking about the whole of life aspects. And I will give you a simple example. In New York, in the US, around 100 years, maybe 120, 130 years, the amount of the dung of horses there, sometimes it reached 5 stories high, and sometimes it led to the death of people. This was the beginning of people having to do something about it. And this is exactly what I'm speaking about. So this was the catalyst for starting the manufacture of automobiles in the US. And I think that this was an opportunity spotted by Ford, the famous Ford. And through this, the automobile industry has started. And of course, this is something that we're speaking about now in terms of emissions. We are speaking about the next 8 years. But what I'm saying does not mean that as leaders, as people in charge, even as listeners, should not perceive danger. But what you should always be sure of is that this danger will be countered, will be tackled, as I said, by everybody, one way or another, because there is an inherent opportunity there. I mean, how many millions of vehicles do we have in the world? I think hundreds of millions. So imagine in these 8 years the amount of electric cars that we could manufacture, or even cars that run by electricity and gas. Maybe they would reach 10%, 20%. This is the real opportunity that we can use, replacing the huge number of cars that run on fossil fuel. All of this could be turned to cars that run on renewables. In Egypt, we perceived that, just like everybody did, but we moved, and we moved quickly. And here I'm speaking about vehicles and cars. And more than 5 years ago, we spoke to the relevant companies to have electric cars industry in Egypt. And we did start to have initiatives for replacing the cars. First, to replace their fuel with gas, and then as of 2023, like His Excellency the Prime Minister mentioned, we are going to have the first Egyptian electric car in the market. This means that we in Egypt know that this is a car that is very expensive to manufacture. It needs a huge infrastructure for it to be able to function. So this means that we are moving in this on this track. So if we, in all our countries, in the private sector, perceive the opportunities lying in the procedures of climate change, then we're all going to move. I will also give you 2 examples from Egypt that were for us opportunities. Dr. Mustafa spoke about the lakes and the amount of pollution and contamination in these lakes. I'm speaking here about a topic that hasn't been tackled for tens or hundreds of years in Egypt. Egypt. And for 4 years, we've been working on a program to purify and clean these lakes. And this will lead to creating job opportunities for those working on this process. And also these lakes will turn into an economic energy for the country, an economic asset. Also, the Decent Life Haya Karima project that His Excellency the Prime Minister spoke about, it aims at changing the lives of 60 million Egyptian citizens through the lining of canals. Here we're speaking about 40,000 kilometers of canals that are going to cost us more than 80 billion Egyptian pounds. This, however, means that there are going to be jobs created for those working on these processes, in addition to the means of transport and so on. So despite the fact that we had a crisis that we needed to counter, that was very costly to work on, but at the end we need to see the light at the end of the tunnel, the opportunities that lie there, in the core of which is climate reform. Also, when we speak about the reform of road networks in Egypt, some people thought that we exaggerated in regards to the size of this project. We're speaking about 6, 7, 8 lanes with huge proportions, but this actually means that we were targeting reducing traffic in order to reduce emissions. So it's like domino effect. And in Egypt, we shoulder a lot of costs, but still we solve the problem. And Egypt, like His Excellency said, has a very small contribution to the global emissions. However, we paid attention to that and we moved on towards its goals very efficiently. And this is why I'm addressing our youth. The will to change is very important. Destroying our Mother Earth is something that human beings are capable of, but still we can work on warning people through the media, through social media, so that people would move towards countering this, because this in itself is an opportunity. Because if we target changing X million of cars that run on fossil fuel to cars that run on renewables, then I think that this will mean that we have an opportunity. Human beings will remain the developers until the human beings believe that they are the masters of the universe. Once they reach this belief, then the universe will end at this point. Thank you so much.
شكرا فخامة الرئيس عبد الفتاح السيسي رئيس جمهورية مصر العربية.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, President عبد الفتاح السيسي, President of the Arab Republic of Egypt. Thank you so much to our dear panelists, and thanks to the guests. Now the session is adjourned. Thank you.